You share more in common with a lobster than you'd ever want to admit. 350 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before trees, long before anything resembling a human being walked this earth, lobsters were already competing for territory, already fighting for status, and already running on the exact same brain chemical that right now, today, is determining whether you feel confident or defeated. That chemical is serotonin. And here is where it gets strange. If you give a lobster Prozac, the same antidepressant prescribed to millions of human beings, it cheers up, it stands taller, it fights harder. The same drug, the same molecule, the same effect, separated by 1/3 of a billion years of evolution. So what does a crustacean on the ocean floor have to teach you about standing up for yourself, choosing real friends, raising your children, and putting your life in order? More than you think. A lot more. This is 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. Peterson is a clinical psychologist and university professor who spent more than 20 years treating clients, studying personality, and trying to answer one of the hardest questions a person can ask. Why do people suffer, and what can be done about it? Not in some abstract academic way, in a way that actually changes how you live on a Monday morning. This book became one of the best-selling non-fiction titles of the past decade, translated into more than 50 languages. But here is what matters more than the sales numbers. It resonated because it spoke to something people already felt, but couldn't quite put into words. That life is difficult, that suffering is not optional, and that despite all of that, there are ways of being, specific, practical, ancient ways of being, that can make you strong enough to carry the weight. Peterson draws on evolutionary biology, clinical psychology, philosophy, religious mythology, and his own often painful personal experiences to lay out 12 principles for living a meaningful life. Not a comfortable life, not an easy life, a meaningful one. And there is a very big difference between those two things. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through the first 6 of those 12 rules. We'll start 350 million years in the past, on the ocean floor, and we'll end with a challenge that might be the hardest thing you'll ever do. Looking honestly at your own life before you dare to criticize anyone else's. Let's begin. Rule 1. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Picture a lobster on the ocean floor. He's looking for a home, a safe crevice under a rock where he can rest, shed his shell when the time comes, and be protected from predators. The problem is, good shelters are scarce, and there are a lot of lobsters. So when 2 lobsters meet near the same prime piece of real estate, something has to happen. They have to decide who gets it. And here's the remarkable thing. They don't just charge at each other blindly. They've developed an elaborate, multi-stage conflict resolution system that has been refined over hundreds of millions of years. First, they size each other up. They circle, claws open, spraying chemical jets from special nozzles under their eyes. Those jets contain information about size, health, mood, and fighting history. Sometimes that's enough. A smaller lobster reads the signals, decides this isn't his fight, and backs away. No blood spilled, problem solved. But if the 2 are closely matched, they escalate. They advance and retreat, antennae whipping. If neither backs down, the claws come out. They grapple, each trying to flip the other onto its back. A lobster that gets flipped usually concedes, and if even that doesn't settle it, they tear at each other, ripping off legs, claws, antennae. One wins, one loses, and sometimes the loser doesn't survive. Now here is what matters. After a lobster loses a serious fight, its brain chemistry physically changes. The ratio of serotonin to octopamine shifts dramatically. The defeated lobster produces less serotonin and more octopamine, and in response, its posture collapses. It hunches. It curls in on itself. It becomes skittish, reactive, and withdrawn. It won't fight again, even against opponents it could easily beat. It has been reprogrammed neurochemically for defeat, and if the defeat is severe enough, something even more extreme happens. The lobster's brain essentially dissolves. It grows a new one, a smaller subordinate brain, more suited to its new lowly position. The brain it had when it was dominant simply cannot handle the transformation from king to bottom dweller without being completely rebuilt. Now you might be thinking, that's a fascinating nature documentary, but what does any of it have to do with me? I'm not a lobster. I don't live on the ocean floor, but you do live inside a dominance hierarchy. You always have. Every human society ever studied has one. Every workplace, every school, every family, every social group, they all have a pecking order. And deep in the most ancient part of your brain, far beneath your conscious thoughts and your civilized manners, sits a calculator that has been tracking your position in that hierarchy since the day you were born. That calculator runs on serotonin, the same chemical, the same system, 350 million years old. When you're doing well, when people respect you, when your work is going right, when your relationships are stable, that ancient calculator registers a high position. Serotonin flows freely. You stand tall, you feel confident, you sleep well, you think clearly. You can plan for the future because, as far as your brain is concerned, the future looks safe enough to invest in. But when you're losing, when you've been rejected, fired, humiliated, betrayed, the calculator drops your status, serotonin falls, and everything changes. Your posture collapses, you become anxious, reactive, and impulsive. You start making short-term decisions because your brain no longer trusts the future. You're more vulnerable to illness, more susceptible to addiction, more likely to take desperate risks for fleeting pleasure because the ancient system running your body has concluded that things are unlikely to improve. And here is the cruelest part. Once you start losing, you're statistically more likely to keep losing. The lobster that lost its last fight is more likely to lose the next one, not because its opponent is stronger, but because the loser no longer believes in itself. Its brain has been chemically rewired for submission. This is what Peterson calls the principle of unequal distribution. Winners tend to keep winning, losers tend to keep losing. The rich get richer, the defeated get more defeated, and the gap between them compounds over time. You've seen this in people. Think about someone you know, maybe even yourself, who went through a bad stretch, a painful breakup, a job loss, a period of bullying. What happens? The shoulders curve inward, the eyes drop to the floor, the voice gets quieter, the body physically shrinks, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. And other people notice. They don't always notice consciously, but their ancient calculators do. They read the signals and conclude, this person is low status. This person is not a threat. This person can be ignored, or worse, targeted. And so the cycle continues. The person who was bullied as a child carries that defeated posture into adulthood. The physiological adaptation that once made sense, cringe, retreat, avoid confrontation, is now counterproductive. But the body doesn't know that. The body is still living in the past, and the past keeps recreating itself. So what breaks the cycle? Peterson's answer is deceptively simple, but it cuts deep. He says, stand up straight, literally. Pull your shoulders back. Lift your chin. Look people in the eye. Not because it's a magic trick, not because posture alone will fix your life, but because your body and your mind are not separate systems. They are one system, and the relationship between them runs in both directions. If you're feeling defeated and you hunch over, the hunching reinforces the feeling. Your brain reads your own body language and concludes, yes, we're still losing. But if you straighten up, even when you don't feel like it, your brain reads that signal too. It registers the posture of someone who is at least willing to engage, and the serotonin system responds. Researchers have actually tested this. If you ask people to arrange their facial muscles into a sad expression, one muscle at a time, without telling them what emotion they're mimicking, they report feeling sadder, If you arrange their faces into a smile, they feel happier. Emotion is not just something that happens inside your head. It is something your body performs, and performance can be directed. But this goes far beyond posture. Standing up straight with your shoulders back is not just a physical instruction. It's a metaphor for how you engage with life itself. Peterson writes that standing up means voluntarily accepting the burden of being. It means deciding to face the world instead of cowering from it. It means stepping forward into the dominance hierarchy, not to dominate, not to crush others, but to occupy your rightful territory and defend it. To say, I exist, I matter, I have a right to be here. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. People start treating you differently. Not because you've changed what you know, or what you own, or what you've accomplished, but because you've changed the signal you're broadcasting. You look like someone who can handle things, and the world, which was previously stacking the odds against you, begins to tilt, just slightly but measurably in your favor. The conversations go better, the opportunities appear more frequently, the serotonin rises, and the ancient calculator recalibrates. This is not positive thinking. Peterson is very clear about that. He's not asking you to lie to yourself. He's asking you to recognize that the feedback loop between your body, your mind, and the social world around you is real, it is ancient, and it can work for you just as easily as it has been working against you. If you present yourself as defeated, the world will treat you as defeated. If you stand up physically, psychologically, spiritually, the world will respond to that too. Look at the lobster. 350 million years of evolutionary wisdom encoded in that simple, armored body. It knows something you've forgotten. Your posture is not cosmetic. It is a declaration. It tells the world, and it tells you, whether you intend to face what's coming or collapse under its weight. So tend carefully to your posture. Quit drooping and hunching around. Speak your mind. Put your desires forward as if you had a right to them, at least the same right as others. Walk tall, gaze forthrightly ahead, dare to be dangerous, and encourage the serotonin to flow plentifully through the neural pathways desperate for its calming influence. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule 2. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Imagine that 100 people are prescribed a medication by their doctor, a drug that could help them, maybe even save their life. What happens next? 1/3 of those 100 people will never fill the prescription. They'll walk out of the doctor's office, drive past the pharmacy, and never pick it up. Of the remaining 67 who do fill it, about half won't take it correctly. They'll miss doses. They'll quit early. Some won't take it at all. The bottle will sit in the medicine cabinet, untouched, gathering dust. Now think about what that means. A trained physician examined them, identified a problem, and offered a solution. And more than half of them, silently, passively, without any dramatic act of rebellion, simply refused to follow through. Now imagine something different. Imagine it's not you who's sick. It's your dog. You love that dog. He's been limping. You take him to the vet. The vet gives you a prescription. What happens? You fill it. You administer it on schedule. You follow the instructions to the letter. You might even set an alarm on your phone to make sure you don't forget. People are better at filling prescriptions for their pets than for themselves. Think about that. Your golden retriever gets more reliable medical care from you than you get from you. And it doesn't stop at prescriptions. Consider organ transplants. Some people wait years for a donated kidney. Years on dialysis, a brutal process, 5 to 7 times a week, 8 hours at a time. Blood pumped out of the body, through a machine and back in. Finally, after all that waiting and suffering, they receive the transplant. And then they don't take the anti-rejection drugs. They lose the kidney. They lose everything. How is this possible? How can someone endure that much, sacrifice that much, wait that long, and then sabotage their own recovery? There are practical explanations, of course. Some people are isolated. some are depressed, some can barely afford the medication. But those explanations, while real, don't fully account for the pattern. Something deeper is at work. Peterson believes the answer lies buried in one of the oldest stories ever told, the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. And before you tune out because this sounds religious, stay with me. Peterson isn't reading it as theology, he's reading it as psychology. He's asking, what does this ancient story reveal about how human beings actually experience themselves? Here's the short version. Adam and Eve live in paradise. They walk with God. They're naked and they're not ashamed. They're innocent, which is another way of saying they're unconscious. They don't know who they are yet. Then the serpent appears and tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She does. She shares it with Adam, and their eyes are opened. That sounds like it should be a good thing. But what do they see the moment their eyes open? They see that they're naked. They see their own vulnerability. They see that their bodies are fragile and exposed and imperfect. And for the first time, they feel shame. They scramble to cover themselves. They hide from God. Now, if you've ever stood in front of a mirror and felt a wave of self-disgust, if you've ever looked at your own body, your own face, your own life and thought, I'm not enough, then you already understand this story at a gut level. The fruit didn't give Adam and Eve some abstract philosophical knowledge. It gave them self-consciousness. And self-consciousness is a brutal gift, because once you can see yourself, you can see everything that's wrong with yourself. And it gets worse, because once you know how you can be hurt, once you understand your own vulnerabilities, you also know how to hurt others. You know exactly where to aim. You know what words will cut the deepest. You know how to humiliate, how to betray, how to twist the knife. That's the knowledge of good and evil. Not just knowing that suffering exists, but knowing how to create it deliberately. This is why, according to Peterson, we don't take care of ourselves. It's not laziness. It's not stupidity. It's something far more disturbing. We know too much about ourselves. We know our own cowardice, our own dishonesty, our own petty cruelties. We know every shortcut we've taken, every promise we've broken, every time we looked the other way when we shouldn't have. No one knows your failures more intimately than you do, and deep down, some part of you has concluded that a creature this flawed doesn't deserve to be taken care of. A dog, though, a dog is innocent. A dog hasn't betrayed anyone. A dog hasn't lied or cheated or acted against its own conscience. A dog is pure in a way that no self-aware human being can ever be again. So of course you'll give the dog its medicine. The dog deserves it. But here is where Peterson turns the whole thing on its head. He says, you are not just your failures. Yes, you're flawed. Yes, you've done things you're ashamed of. Every human being has. But you're also someone who gets up every morning and tries. You're someone who holds things together even when they're falling apart. You go to work when you're sick. You comfort your children when you're afraid. You show up for people who need you even when you have nothing left. And that, the quiet, unglamorous, daily heroism of ordinary people just keeping the world running, that is miraculous. It deserves respect. It deserves care. Peterson tells a story about two men he knew, both damaged. One had been injured in a car accident. The other had a degenerative neurological disease. Neither could do their job alone, but together, one compensating for what the other lacked. They worked side by side for years, repairing utility lines, each one covering for his partner's limitations. Neither of them complained. Neither of them quit. That's what people do, all the time, everywhere. They carry impossible burdens and they keep going. They hold families together through grief and illness and financial ruin. They raise children under conditions that would break a lesser species, and they do it without applause, without recognition, without anyone stopping to say, you know what, that's incredible. The fact that you're still standing is a miracle. So Peterson's second rule is not a soft suggestion, it's a moral obligation. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping, not someone you can neglect, punish, or abandon, not someone whose needs don't matter. You are not merely your own worst critic. You are also the only person who can reliably steer your life in the right direction. And if you won't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else either. Your family needs you functional. Your friends need you present. The world needs whatever it is you have to offer, and you can't offer it if you've let yourself fall apart. This doesn't mean being self-indulgent. Peterson is very clear about that. Treating yourself well is not the same as giving yourself whatever you want in the moment. You don't help a child by feeding them candy for every meal. You help a child by making sure they brush their teeth, wear their coat in the cold, and learn to be responsible. The same applies to you. Ask yourself, what would genuinely be good for me? Not what would feel good right now. What would make me stronger, healthier, more capable, more honest? What career would challenge me? What habits would improve my health? What relationships would I need to repair? Define who you are. Refine your personality. Choose your destination and articulate your being. Then take care of yourself. Not because you're perfect, but because the task ahead of you is difficult, and you'll need every ounce of strength you can gather. You would do it for your dog. You would do it for your child. Now do it for yourself. Rule 3. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Peterson grew up in Fairview, Alberta, a small town of about 3,000 people, 400 miles from the nearest city. Cable television didn't exist yet. Neither did video games or the internet. Winters lasted 5 months. Temperatures dropped to 40 below, and the darkness was almost total. By December, the sun didn't rise until 9:30 in the morning, and it was nearly gone again by the time school let out. There wasn't much for young people to do, so they drove endlessly, around and around the same handful of streets, up Main, past the high school, around the north end of town, down to the west side and back. If they weren't driving in town, they were driving in the countryside, on the grid of gravel roads that stretched forever across the flat prairie. And if they weren't driving, they were at a party. The parties were not good. The lights were always low. The music was too loud for conversation, which didn't matter much because there was little to say. Someone was always too drunk. Someone was always too aggressive. There was a dreary, suffocating aimlessness to all of it. The unspoken agreement that nothing was really going to happen, and that was fine, and nobody was going to mention it. Peterson had a friend. We'll call him Chris. Chris was smart. He read science fiction. He liked electronics and engineering. He had real potential, but something in his family had gone wrong. Something Peterson could never quite identify, and Chris had been left unattended to in some important way. Despite his intelligence, he was angry, resentful, and hopeless. Chris drove a battered 1972 blue Ford pickup with dents in every quarter panel and matching dents inside from where his friends' bodies had slammed against the interior during his many accidents. The bumper sticker read, "Be alert, the world needs more alerts." It would have been funnier if it weren't so obviously a manifesto. Every time Chris wrecked the truck, his father fixed it and bought him something else, a motorbike he didn't care for, an ice cream van he never used to sell ice cream. Chris had a younger cousin named Ed. Tall, good-looking, charming, witty. You would have predicted a bright future for Ed if you'd met him when he was 12. But Ed drifted downward too, slowly, into a half-formed, semi-drifting life, dropping out, smoking pot, hanging around people who were going nowhere. Neither Chris nor Ed improved after they discovered marijuana. Some people can handle it. These two couldn't. It didn't make them more creative or more relaxed. It made them foggier, slower, and less likely to ever climb out of the hole they were sinking into. Years later, after Peterson had moved to Edmonton for university, Ed showed up at his apartment. Peterson was glad to see him. He hoped Ed had turned things around, but Ed arrived looking older, bolder, and stooped. His eyes were the red slits of a habitual stoner. He'd taken a lawn mowing job, which would have been fine for a student, but which was a dead end for someone with his intelligence. And he'd brought a friend. The friend was obliterated, completely stoned. He could barely sit upright. He looked around Peterson's clean, civilized apartment as if he'd arrived on a different planet. At one point he stared at the ceiling and managed to say, and these were his only words, "My particles are scattered all over the ceiling." Truer words were never spoken. Peterson took Ed aside and told him politely that he had to leave, that he shouldn't have brought this person into his home. Ed nodded. He understood, and that was almost worse, because understanding meant he knew exactly what he'd become, and he'd shown up anyway. Chris later wrote Peterson a letter. One line from it stayed with him for decades. "I had friends," Chris wrote, "before. Anyone with enough self-contempt that they could forgive me mine." Think about that sentence. Read it again in your mind. Anyone with enough self-contempt that they could forgive me mine. That is the operating principle behind every destructive friendship you've ever witnessed or been part of. People don't always choose bad friends because they can't find good ones. Sometimes they choose bad friends because bad friends won't challenge them to change. Bad friends will let you stay exactly where you are. They won't raise an eyebrow when you waste another evening, skip another opportunity, or make the same mistake for the 20th time. And in exchange, you extend them the same courtesy. It's a pact, an unspoken mutual agreement to sacrifice the future for the comfort of the present. You don't call me on my failures, and I won't call you on yours. That way we can both avoid the terrifying work of actually becoming better. But what about compassion? What about loyalty? What about not abandoning people when they're down? Peterson addresses this head-on, and his answer is uncomfortable. He says before you help someone, you should find out why that person is in trouble. Not everyone who is failing is a victim of unjust circumstances. Some people are failing because they have chosen to fail. Some people have decided, consciously or unconsciously, that the path upward is too difficult and have settled for the path down. And if you attach yourself to someone like that out of pity or guilt or a desire to feel virtuous, you're not rescuing them, you're sinking with them. Peterson points to a fascinating finding from organizational psychology. Imagine a high-performing team. Everyone is sharp, motivated, and working toward a shared goal. Now take one underperforming, cynical, unmotivated person and place them in the middle of that team. What happens? Does the struggling newcomer rise to the occasion? Almost never. Instead, the entire team degenerates. The hard workers start to feel resentful. The newcomer's laziness becomes contagious. Morale drops. Quality drops. The same pattern holds when a delinquent teenager is placed among well-behaved peers. The delinquency spreads. The stability doesn't. Down is a lot easier than up. This doesn't mean you should never help anyone. It means you should be honest about your motives. Are you helping because you genuinely believe this person wants to improve and is willing to do the work? Or are you helping because it makes you feel morally superior? Because it's easier than confronting your own problems? Because the contrast between your friend's disaster and your own life makes you feel like you're doing all right by comparison? Peterson puts it bluntly. If you have a friend whose friendship you wouldn't recommend to your sister, or your father, or your son, why would you have such a friend for yourself? You might call it loyalty, but loyalty is not the same as stupidity. Loyalty must be negotiated, fairly and honestly. Friendship is a reciprocal arrangement. Now here's the other side. If you surround yourself with people who support your upward aim, people who are genuinely trying to improve their own lives, they will not tolerate your cynicism. They will encourage you when you do something right. They will push back carefully when you do something wrong. They will hold you to a standard, not because they want to control you, but because they want you to succeed. And their success in turn will challenge and inspire you, not because they're showing off, but but because every good example is a silent invitation. It says, you could be more than you are. Chris never found those people. Or maybe he found them and couldn't stay near them, because standing next to someone who is genuinely trying makes your own refusal to try almost unbearable. Not long after his 40th birthday, the night before in fact, Chris drove his old pickup into the bush, ran a hose from the exhaust pipe to the cab, and sat there in the front seat, smoking, waiting. Peterson called his father afterward. "My beautiful boy," the old man sobbed. "Friendship is not a trivial thing. It is not a convenience or a pastime. The people you surround yourself with will shape the trajectory of your life more profoundly than almost any other single factor. They will either pull you upward or drag you down, and the choice of which kind of person to keep close, that is one of the most important decisions you will ever make. Choose people who want things to be better, not worse. It's a good thing, not a selfish thing, to choose people who are good for you. It is appropriate and praiseworthy to associate with people whose lives would be improved if they saw your life improve. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Rule 4. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. A cognitive psychologist named Daniel Simons once conducted one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. He sat his research subjects in front of a screen and showed them a short video. In the video, 2 teams of 3 people, one team in white shirts, the other in black, bounce and pass basketballs back and forth in a small space. Simons asked his subjects to count the number of passes made by the team in white. The subjects watched carefully. They counted. When the video ended, Simons asked for their answer. Most said 15. That was correct. They felt good about it. They'd passed the test. Then Simons asked a second question. "Did you see the gorilla?" The subject stared at him. "What gorilla?" So he played the video again. And there it was. About a minute in, a person in a full gorilla suit walks directly into the middle of the game, stops, faces the camera, beats its chest, and walks off, right through the center of the screen. Enormous, unmistakable, impossible to miss, except that half the people watching missed it completely. They were so focused on counting passes that a chest-beating gorilla standing directly in front of them was invisible. Simons didn't stop there. In a later experiment, he showed subjects a video of a person being served at a counter. The server ducks behind the counter to grab something, and a completely different person stands back up. Different face, different body, sometimes even a different gender or race, and most subjects didn't notice. What does this tell us? It tells us that we are almost entirely blind. Not physically, our eyes work fine, but our perception is ruthlessly selective. We see what we're aiming at, and we are blind to virtually everything else. This is not a flaw, it's a necessity. The world is so overwhelmingly complex that if you tried to perceive all of it simultaneously, you would be paralyzed. Your brain doesn't have the processing power, so it makes a deal with reality. I'll focus on this one narrow slice, and I'll let everything else disappear. This is why what you aim at matters so much. Your values, the things you've decided are important, don't just guide your actions. They literally determine what you can see. If you're focused on counting passes, gorillas are invisible. If you're focused on your boss's job, your own opportunities disappear. If you're focused on what someone else has, you become blind to what you already possess. And this is where comparison becomes toxic. Peterson doesn't say that standards are irrelevant. They're not. You need standards. Without some concept of better and worse, you have no reason to do anything at all. The internal critic that says you could do better is not your enemy. It's a necessary voice. Without it, you'd never improve. The problem arises when that critic selects a single, arbitrary dimension of comparison, money maybe, or beauty, or status, treats it as if it's the only dimension that exists, and then measures you against someone who is world-class in that exact domain. You're a decent guitar player. but you're not Jimi Hendrix. You're a good cook, but you'll never run a Michelin-starred restaurant. You're a reasonably successful professional, but someone out there is younger, richer, and more accomplished. The internal critic seizes on these comparisons and builds a devastating case. You see, it whispers, you're mediocre, you're ordinary, nothing you do matters. But that voice is lying to you, or rather it's telling you a very small, very distorted piece of the truth and presenting it as the whole story. Because here is what it leaves out. You are not playing one game, you are playing many games simultaneously. You have a career and a family and friendships and personal projects and a body and a mind and a spiritual life. You might be struggling at work but thriving as a parent. You might be financially strained but deeply loved. You might be losing at one game while quietly winning at 3 others you haven't even bothered to notice. Furthermore, the specifics of your life are so unique, so particular to you, that comparison with anyone else is almost meaningless. Your colleague earns more than you, but his marriage is collapsing. The celebrity you admire has a public drinking problem. The neighbor with the bigger house is privately miserable. You don't know what anyone else's life actually looks like from the inside. You only know the curated, polished, public-facing version. And you're comparing that to the uncensored, unfiltered, every flaw visible version of yourself. So what's the alternative? If you shouldn't compare yourself to other people, what do you compare yourself to? Yesterday. You compare yourself to who you were yesterday. That's a game you can actually win. Not by achieving some grand transformation overnight, but by making things just slightly better today than they were the day before. One small repair, one honest conversation, one neglected task finally completed, one corner of your life straightened out. Peterson describes this as a kind of internal negotiation, and the way he frames it is unexpectedly gentle. He says, imagine that you are someone difficult to motivate. Imagine you're lazy and resentful and hard to get along with. You can't just bark orders at yourself and expect compliance. That makes you a tyrant, and no one cooperates with a tyrant for long, not even you. So instead, you negotiate. You ask yourself, politely, without sarcasm, is there one thing I could do today that would make things slightly better? One thing I would actually be willing to do. And then you listen for the answer. Maybe it's clearing that stack of papers off your desk. Maybe it's making a phone call you've been avoiding. Maybe it's apologizing to someone you hurt. Whatever it is, you do it. And then, this is the crucial part, you reward yourself. You have that coffee, you watch that show, you take that walk, because if you promise yourself something in exchange for effort, and then you don't deliver, you will never trust yourself again. Do that every day. Just one small voluntary improvement. And watch what happens over weeks and months and years. Your baseline shifts upward. What was once difficult becomes routine. What was once unimaginable becomes merely hard. The compound interest of tiny daily improvements is staggering. 3 years of that, and your life will be unrecognizable. Not because you performed some heroic act, but because you stopped comparing yourself to everyone else and started, quietly and consistently, outperforming your own past. There is something else hidden inside this rule. Peterson says that if your life is not going well, perhaps it's not the world that's the problem. Perhaps it's your values. Perhaps what you want, what you think you want, is actually blinding you to what you need. The person who fixates on getting their boss's job might be making themselves miserable for years over something that wouldn't even satisfy them if they got it. But as long as they keep wanting it, they can't see anything else. So sometimes the answer is not to try harder at the same game. Sometimes the answer is to change the game entirely, to let go of what you thought you wanted and open yourself to the possibility that something better exists. Something you couldn't see before, because your old ambition was standing in the way. Aim small. Aim at something you could do, would do, and will do today. Let the critic inside you become a collaborator instead of an executioner. Stop measuring your interior against everyone else's exterior and pay attention to where you actually are right now so you can figure out where to go next. What you aim at determines what you see. Aim carefully, aim upward, and compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Rule 5. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Picture a crowded airport terminal. Hundreds of travelers, exhausted, dragging their luggage, trying to get where they need to be, and trailing behind two parents. There's a 3-year-old boy. He's screaming, not crying, screaming, deliberately, at 5-second intervals. Controlled bursts of maximum volume, calculated for maximum impact. Peterson watched this scene unfold. As a parent and a psychologist, he could tell from the tone. This child wasn't at the end of his rope. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't frightened. He was testing. He was seeing what he could get away with. And his parents did nothing. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were jet-lagged. Maybe they'd given up. But Peterson's point is sharp. 30 seconds of carefully directed intervention would have ended it. Instead, they let their child become the object of an entire crowd's contempt. And that is not love. That is neglect disguised as tolerance. He describes another scene. A couple unable to say no to their 2-year-old who misbehaved so badly whenever he was unsupervised that they had to follow him everywhere, every second, every room, hovering an arm's length behind him for the duration of what was supposed to be a pleasant social visit. They thought they were giving him freedom by refusing to correct him. In reality, they had stripped him of every opportunity for genuine independence because he had never learned what no meant. He had no sense of where the boundaries were. And without boundaries, there is no safe territory to explore. This is one of Peterson's most provocative and most misunderstood rules. He is not advocating for authoritarian parenting. He is not saying you should dominate or crush your children's spirit. He is saying something far more nuanced and far more important, that parents who refuse to discipline their children are not being kind. They are being cowardly, and the price of that cowardice is paid entirely by the child. Here is the logic. Your child is going to be socialized, disciplined, corrected, taught the rules, one way or another. Either you do it with love and care and attention to their long-term well-being, or the world does it, harshly and without mercy. The playground will do it. The classroom will do it. The peer group will do it. And later, the workplace, the legal system, and the cold indifference of strangers will do it. A parent who says, "I don't want to be the bad guy," is not sparing their child from correction. They are simply handing that job to someone who doesn't love the child at all. Peterson tells one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire book. A 4-year-old boy had been showing up at his house through a neighborhood babysitting arrangement. The child's mother had told them he wouldn't eat. "That's okay," she said. It was not okay. The boy was withdrawn. He wouldn't play with the other children. He wouldn't make eye contact. He stood in corners, voluntarily, unhappily. When Peterson's wife, Tammy, sat him down at the table with the other kids and put food in front of him, he clamped his mouth shut. He turned his head away. He resisted with the stubborn defensive techniques of a much younger child, a child who had learned that food, attention, and care were not things he could count on. But Tammy wouldn't let him fail. She was patient. She was persistent. She waited with the spoon. She patted his head every time he managed a mouthful and told him he was a good boy. She meant it. He was a good boy. He was a cute, damaged kid who had simply never been shown that the world could be relied upon to feed him. 10 minutes later, he finished his meal. Tammy held up his empty bowl. "Look," she said, "you finished all of it." And this child, this boy, who had been standing alone in corners, who had refused to play, who had frowned at every offered hand, broke into a wide, radiant smile. It transformed his entire face. Everyone at the table saw it. 20 years later, Peterson writes, the memory still brings him to tears. The boy followed Tammy around like a shadow for the rest of the day. He wouldn't let her out of his sight. He curled up in her lap and opened himself back up to the world. He was searching desperately for the love and structure he had been denied. Then his mother came to pick him up. She walked down the stairs, saw her son in Tammy's lap, and said, flatly, resentfully, "Oh, supermom," and she left, black heart unchanged, doomed child in hand. She was a psychologist. Peterson uses this story not to condemn that particular mother, but to illustrate something universal and deeply uncomfortable. Children need structure. They need limits. They need to be taught how to behave, not because adults are tyrants, but because the world is brutal to people who never learned the rules. A 3-year-old who bites and hits and takes other children's toys is doing what comes naturally. Aggression is innate. It doesn't have to be taught. 2-year-olds are statistically the most violent humans on the planet. They kick, bite, and steal because they're exploring the world and testing its limits. That is normal and healthy, but it must be met with correction, or it doesn't go away. It just becomes more sophisticated. The research is clear, and Peterson states it directly. If a child has not been properly socialized by the age of 4, it will be very difficult for other children to tolerate them. They will be rejected by their peers, and once rejected, they lose access to the very social interactions that would have helped them mature. They fall behind, and they keep falling. The unsocialized child becomes the lonely teenager, becomes the bitter, isolated adult, not because they were evil, but because no one cared enough or was brave enough to teach them how the world works. So how do you actually do this? How do you discipline a child without becoming a tyrant? Peterson lays out a handful of practical principles. First, limit the rules. Don't bury your child under 100 regulations. Pick the ones that matter most. Don't bite, kick, or hit. Eat properly. Share. Pay attention when adults are speaking. Go to bed without a war. Be good company. Act so that other people are happy you're around. A child who follows these rules will be welcome everywhere, and being welcome everywhere is one of the greatest gifts you can give a human being. Second, use the minimum necessary force. Start with a glance. Move to a word. Use whatever is the least intervention that actually works. Some children will be stopped cold by a disapproving look. Others need firmer measures. The point is not to overreact. The point is to find the smallest effective response and apply it consistently. Third, parents should come in pairs whenever possible. Not because single parents can't do an extraordinary job. Many do, often heroically. But because raising children is exhausting, and an exhausted parent is a dangerous parent. Not physically dangerous, necessarily, but emotionally dangerous. A parent who is worn out, resentful, and unsupported will eventually snap, not in the moment of misbehavior, but later, unpredictably, over something unrelated. The child will be punished not for what they did, but for the accumulated frustration the parent never dealt with. That's far worse than a clear, immediate, proportionate correction delivered in the moment. And fourth, know yourself. Understand your own capacity for cruelty, pettiness, and revenge. Because if you pretend those things don't live inside you, they will express themselves without your awareness or control. The parent who never sets limits isn't avoiding cruelty. They're storing it up. They're building an invisible reservoir of resentment that will eventually overflow in ways far more damaging than any timeout or firm word ever could. Here is the bottom line. If your child's behavior makes you dislike them, if you feel that flicker of irritation, that subtle withdrawal of warmth, then something needs to be addressed. Not because your feelings are always right, but because if you, the person who loves this child most in the world, are starting to recoil, imagine how everyone else feels. Imagine how their teachers feel, their classmates, the parents of their friends. You love your children, so discipline them. Not with rage, not with cruelty, but with the honest, difficult, patient attention that genuine care requires. Teach them the rules of the world before the world teaches them in ways you cannot control. That is not oppression. That is the deepest form of love. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. In December 2012, a young man walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, and murdered 20 children and 6 staff members. In 1999, 2 teenagers walked into Columbine High School in Colorado and opened fire on their classmates. In the years between and since, mass killings have occurred with a regularity that defies comprehension. Everyone says the same thing afterward. We don't understand. How could someone do this? What went wrong? Peterson says, we do understand. We just don't want to admit it. One of the Columbine killers kept a journal. In it he wrote, with chilling clarity, exactly what he believed and why he intended to act on it. The human race isn't worth fighting for, he wrote, only worth killing. Give the earth back to the animals. They deserve it infinitely more than we do. Nothing means anything anymore. This is not madness in the way we typically imagine madness. Chaotic, incoherent, disconnected from reality. This is something far more dangerous. It is a logical conclusion drawn from a particular set of premises. The premises are these. Life is suffering. The suffering is unjust. The world is fundamentally flawed. Human beings are the source of the flaw. Therefore, human beings, and perhaps being itself, should be destroyed. Peterson takes these thoughts with extreme seriousness. He does not dismiss them as the ravings of a disturbed mind. He treats them as a philosophical position, a dark and terrible one, but a position nonetheless. And he does this because he recognizes that the same line of reasoning, in milder form, lives inside almost everyone. You don't have to be a mass murderer to look at the world and feel that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. You don't have to be insane to wonder whether existence itself might be a cruel joke. The great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, one of the finest minds of the 19th century, at the peak of his fame and creative power, descended into exactly this kind of despair. He concluded that there were only 4 responses to the horror of existence: retreat into childlike ignorance, pursue mindless pleasure, drag yourself forward despite knowing that life is meaningless, or end it. Picture this man, wealthy, famous, beloved by millions of readers around the world, walking through his own estate, past his own library, past shelves full of books he himself had written, and deliberately avoiding the room where his hunting rifles were stored. Tolstoy hid his guns from himself. He refused to walk near ropes. He was afraid of his own conclusions. So this is not a small question. This is the question. If suffering is real, if cruelty is real, if the innocent are punished and the guilty go free, then how can any honest person refrain from cursing the world and everything in it? Peterson's answer comes from an unexpected place. He turns to the story of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was a Russian soldier during the Second World War. He served on the front lines against the Nazi invasion, already a nightmare by any standard. Then he was arrested by his own government. The Soviet secret police intercepted a letter he had written that contained a mild criticism of Stalin. He was beaten, interrogated, and sentenced to 8 years in the labor camps of the Gulag, the vast Soviet prison system where millions suffered and died. In the camps, he endured conditions almost beyond description: forced labor in freezing temperatures, starvation rations, brutality from guards and fellow prisoners alike. Years of his life stolen, his family gone, his career destroyed. And then, as if all of that were not enough, he was diagnosed with cancer. This is the point at which most people would break. This is the point at which resentment, bitterness, and the desire for revenge become entirely understandable, maybe even justified. Solzhenitsyn had every reason to hate. He had every reason to blame. He had every reason to conclude that the universe was fundamentally malevolent, and that the only rational response was despair. But he didn't. Instead, he did something almost incomprehensible. He turned the examination inward. He asked himself, not the world, not God, not the Soviet state, but himself, what did I do wrong? How did I contribute to this catastrophe? He thought back over his life with painful honesty. He remembered his early, unquestioning support of the Communist Party. He remembered the times he had acted against his own conscience. He remembered the small lies, the moral shortcuts, the moments when he had known what was right and chosen what was easy instead. And he took responsibility, not for everything, not for the whole monstrous apparatus of Soviet tyranny, but for his part, for the ways he had personally participated, through silence, through compliance, through cowardice, in the system that had eventually consumed him. That decision changed everything. It gave him something that pure victimhood never could: agency. If the fault was entirely external, if the world was simply and purely evil, then there was nothing to be done. He was trapped. But if some portion of the fault was his, then some portion of the solution was also his. He could change. He could stop lying. He could stop making things worse, and he could start, one careful, honest action at a time, making things better. Solzhenitsyn rebuilt himself in the Gulag. He emerged from those camps, not destroyed, but transformed. And then he wrote. He spent decades composing the Gulag Archipelago, a massive, meticulously documented account of the Soviet prison system, its history, its mechanisms, and the millions of lives it devoured. That book, smuggled out of the Soviet Union, read in secret, broadcast by radio back into the country that had tried to silence its author, did something that seemed impossible. It destroyed the intellectual credibility of communism. It wasn't guns or armies that brought the Soviet system to its knees. It was one man telling the truth about what he had seen and what he had done. Peterson also describes a man he knew personally, a native artist who had endured an almost equally terrible childhood, taken from his family at age 5, thrown into a residential school, unable to speak the language, isolated, starved, abused. He emerged as a young man shattered by rage and self-destruction, alcohol, drugs, hatred for everyone, God, humanity, and himself included. But he stopped. He chose to stop. He quit drinking. He revived the artistic traditions of his people. He trained young men to carry them forward. He built a 50-foot totem pole memorializing the events of his life. He carved a 40-foot canoe from a single log. He gathered his family, held a great potlatch, 16 hours of dancing, hundreds of people in attendance, to grieve what had been done to him and to make peace with it. He decided to be a good person, and then he did the impossible, grueling work required to live that way. These are not fairy tales. These are real people who faced real horrors and chose transformation over revenge. They did not deny their suffering. They did not minimize what had been done to them, but they also did not allow that suffering to become the foundation of a philosophy of destruction. And that is what Peterson is asking of you with this rule. Not that you save the world, not that you fix everything, but that you start with yourself. Have you taken full advantage of the opportunities available to you? Are you working as hard as you could at your job, your relationships, your health? Have you said the things that need to be said to the people who need to hear them? Have you stopped doing the things you know are wrong, even the small things, the private things, the things nobody else can see? Don't blame capitalism. Don't blame the system. Don't blame your enemies. Not yet, not first. Start with yourself. Start with what you can control. Clean your room. Peterson means this literally, but he also means it as a metaphor for every neglected corner of your existence. Fix what's broken. Organize what's chaotic. Tell the truth about what you've been avoiding, because here is the terrible and liberating reality. If some of the fault is yours, then some of the power is yours too. If you are contributing to the suffering in your life, even slightly, even unconsciously, then you have the ability to stop. And if you can stop making things worse, you can start slowly, carefully, making things better. And if enough people did that, if enough people set their own houses in order before they tried to reorganize the world itself might begin to change. You cannot fix what you will not face. You cannot improve what you refuse to examine. Start where you are. Start with what you know is wrong. Start today. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Key takeaways. We've covered a lot of ground. 6 rules. 6 different angles on the same fundamental challenge. How to live a life that's strong enough to bear the weight of its own suffering. Let's walk through them one more time. Not as a summary, but as a single thread. Because these rules are not a random collection. They build on each other. Each one leads to the next. And together they form something much larger than any individual piece. It starts with biology. Rule 1. You are an ancient creature running on neurochemistry that is 350 million years old. The dominance hierarchy is not a modern invention. It is not a social construct. It is woven into the deepest architecture of your nervous system. Your posture, your confidence, your willingness to stand your ground. These are not cosmetic details. They are signals. They tell the world, and they tell your own brain, whether you intend to engage with life or shrink from it. Stand up, shoulders back. That's the first step. It changes the feedback loop between your body and your mind, between your mind and the world. But standing up is not enough if you're neglecting the person who's doing the standing. That's rule 2. You treat yourself worse than you treat your dog, and there's a reason for that. You know yourself too well. You know every failure, every lie, every act of cowardice, and some part of you has concluded that you don't deserve care. Peterson says that conclusion is understandable, but wrong. You are flawed, yes, but you are also capable of extraordinary endurance, compassion, and courage. You matter. Treat yourself like it. Once you're taking care of yourself, you need to look at who you've surrounded yourself with. Rule 3. Your friends are not neutral forces in your life. They are either pulling you upward or dragging you down. If the people around you tolerate your worst behaviors and never challenge you to be better, they are not your friends. They are your accomplices. Choose people who want things to improve. Choose people who will celebrate your victories and confront your failures. Choose people whose lives would get better if yours did. With the right people around you, you can stop playing the comparison game that has been poisoning your self-worth. Rule 4. You are not competing against the entire world. You are competing against yourself. Yesterday's version of yourself. Aim small. Aim precisely. Fix one thing today that was broken yesterday. Do that consistently, and the compound interest will transform your life in ways you can barely imagine. And if you have children, your responsibility extends beyond yourself. Rule 5. Your children need discipline, not punishment delivered in anger, but structure provided with love. If you won't set limits, the world will, and the world is far less merciful than a caring parent. Teach them the rules. Teach them young. Give them the gift of being welcome wherever they go. Finally, Rule 6. Before you criticize the world, look at your own life. Before you blame the system, ask yourself whether you've done everything within your power to make your own situation better. Start with what you can control. Stop doing the things you know are wrong. Tell the truth. Clean up the mess. Set your house in order. These 6 rules are not soft suggestions. They are the foundation. Stand up. Take care of yourself. Choose your friends wisely. Measure yourself against your own past. Discipline your children with love, and get your own life together before you try to fix anyone else's. That's the ground floor. That's where the real work begins. And the real work, the deep work, the hard work, the work that touches the meaning of existence itself, that's what comes next. Closing. We started this video on the ocean floor with a lobster, an ancient creature that has been fighting for its place in the world since before trees existed. And we end it with a question that might seem much simpler, but is actually much harder. Can you look at your own life, honestly, without flinching, and take responsibility for what you find there? Can you stop blaming everyone else long enough to notice the things you could fix, the changes you could make, the lies you could stop telling? Not because the world is fair. It's not. Not because your suffering doesn't matter. It does. But because waiting for the world to improve while you refuse to improve yourself is a recipe for bitterness that ends only one way. These first 6 rules are the foundation Peterson builds his entire philosophy on. Stand up, take care of yourself, choose the right people, aim carefully, raise your children well, clean up your own mess. But once the foundation is set, once the house is in order, a much bigger question emerges. If life is suffering, and if you've accepted responsibility for your own corner of that suffering, then what is the point? What makes all of this worth it? What is the difference between a life of mere survival and a life of genuine meaning? That's what the next 6 rules are about. Sacrifice, truth, listening, precision, courage, and the small, startling moments of beauty that can sustain you even when everything else has fallen apart. Part 2 is on the channel now. I'll see you there. If you found value in this video, do me a favor, drop a comment, and tell me which of these 6 rules hit you the hardest. I read every one of them, and if you want to go deeper into this book, I've left a link in the description to grab your own copy on Amazon or Audible. Sometimes a book doesn't just change how you think, it changes how you stand. This might be one of those books. Hit subscribe, we've got a lot more to cover, and every book might be the one that changes everything.